Kantar, we're really interested in being involved in this discourse around gender difference in the marketing and brand sphere. We've done work before, actually. Back in 2017, we wrote a report called Winning Over Women, which was looking very specifically at the way that financial services serve or don't serve female customers. And we identified a large opportunity there for clients from a commercial perspective. We explored it more in Winning Over Wealth as well. We were looking very much in the investments sphere. But we also look at extensively around things like inclusion in advertising and the way that people can get their media planning right from gender aspects as well. So it's something that we feel very passionately about. And we felt at this point in time, just as hopefully we're starting to come out of the pandemic, she says hopefully, we thought it was a great point to reflect and think about some of these issues we've explored before. So what we did was we started off with expert interviews where we went to a wide range of different people, and thank you to those of you on the call already who've given your time. And we were really testing some hypotheses and thinking around some of the things we already knew, but that we thought we were learning from through the pandemic and other thought leadership work we've done. We then, as you would expect from Kantar, hopefully, we applied all the breadth and depth of expertise that we have here as an organisation to understand people. We used a more sort of traditional classic approach of a survey, but we also used our tools like Needscope, which really gets to the emotional connection that individuals have with brands, to understand about some of the areas around that in financial services. We went into the digital sphere using our search landscape analytics to really understand the different behaviours we've seen between men and women in that area. We have a tool called Eva, which really helps us uncover the way that people are decoding, expressing themselves through things like photos in social media, to really understand and decode that aspect. And of course, we have our world-leading link testing tool to understand the impact of creative in this area on women and the way they perceive things. So we brought all of those findings together, and I think we have some really interesting insights to share with you today before we go into the panel. So without further ado, I'm going to hand to my colleague Rosi to take you through those.
Thank you, Amy. Apologies to Gareth Southgate as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, as a number of factors converge. And I'd like to start with the impact of the pandemic. Amy has already referred to the fact that it's been disproportionate. And if we think that almost 50% of younger women earning less than 30,000, which is an awful lot of people, have actually been either seriously impacted or impacted financially, it's really a stark reminder of how disadvantaged they have been. And if you add to that the challenge they face in getting on the property ladder, repaying student loans, you can see actually it's a pretty hard and tough situation for them. The reasons are quite clear in the overrepresentation in industries such as hospitality and beauty, the high levels of furlough, and indeed the fact that a lot of them have given up their jobs or reduced their hours to look after their families. So I think the obvious outcome of this is increasing financial and emotional pressure. But it's not all bad news. It's also been recorded, in a lot of ways that actually we've all been saving, albeit unconsciously. One of our expert interviewers called it a saving by osmosis, or someone else called the savings built up the pandemic stash, both of which I think are extremely memorable. But overall, we know the UK savings ratio has dramatically increased. It's 16.3% compared with 6.8% a year ago. But we do see from our survey that men have saved twice as much as women. And before anyone accuses women of extravagant spending online, there are some rather more serious reasons for this. In spite of all our efforts, and indeed equal pay legislation, the gender pay gap has in fact widened, not narrowed. And the percentage of women in the higher earning group, earning over 150,000, is still really below 1 in 5. If we take these figures together with the greater pressure on family budgets, more people spending more time in the home, increasing consumption, then these are things which are more often paid for by women. And so we can see, again, further pressure on women's savings, which is greater than it is on men's. And the average amounts, I should say, saved by men are across all age groups. And although proportions are relatively low for men as well as women, men of all age groups are more likely to move their savings into investments. compared to women. So more women are leaving their money in savings accounts. Now, one could argue that is the fact that the saving was unconscious and they may not realize it's there, but 3/4 is saved in low or no interest-bearing accounts. That during this point, the rate was 0.11%, which I think we can probably regard as zero. We also saw that women were more likely to use a savings account, something which we will discuss in more detail later. And their searches, and Amy referred to this, we looked at online searches, are around saving and budgeting rather than investing. But we don't want this purely to be about financial impacts, because we know that the impacts of the pandemic go far beyond those. And we repeated the questions we asked 2 years ago, 3 years ago, on self-esteem. And we found that the relative balance between men and women has changed very, very little. And if we look specifically at the under 35s, you'll see almost twice as many men actually rate their self-esteem as above average compared to women, where it is around 1/4. There are probably 2 reasons for this. One is that self-esteem, I think, is very deep-rooted. And secondly, the greater pressures on the pandemic have in fact aggravated the situation for women. But what has changed substantially behind this is the contribution that financial independence is making to overall self-esteem. It's never been as important as it enables us to have choices personally and professionally. And it's been heightened, I think, by the sense of physical and emotional entrapment brought on by the pandemic. And it's been well rehearsed by medics, social psychologists, who have argued that financial independence is indeed a prerequisite of overall wellness. So we're talking about something bigger than purely the financial impact. It's about alleviating stress and making us indeed more able to face an uncertain world. Interestingly, although we've recognized the importance of financial independence, a vast majority of us are still in the sort of stage of thinking about it, researching it, not actually taking much positive action. But I think probably this is an opportunity for the industry, because it suggests that it's a great time for effective communication around the benefits of investing, and specific offers about how to achieve financial independence is clearly a topic of very considerable interest, and there will be significant receptivity. In line with the growing financial awareness, we've also seen a reawakening of some social consciousness, particularly among women, and health consciousness amongst men. And we do see evidence of reprioritization, rationalization of stuff, particularly among women, although I guess that many partners would probably say this is long overdue. However, there is a more serious underlying theme here of more purposeful, sustainable spending in the future. And I think that's something we will come back to in the future. But I think, again, as we mentioned, there are very, very small numbers who are actually investing, and it's particularly the case amongst younger women, where more than twice as many men are investing, and women are missing out on the opportunity to grow their savings. And this, I think, is really, really fundamental if we are to achieve that overall wellness and financial independence as we move forward. Perhaps more worryingly, not only are women not investing today, but half don't intend to do so in the future. And it does fall to around 1/3 of younger women, which potentially suggests greater openness. That's a positive sign, but it's only going to be realized if the confidence gap can be sufficiently closed. So although they're more open to investing, almost half, compared to just 1/4 of younger men, feel they just don't know enough. But I think, and we've been talking about this reflects very much their lack of confidence, their sort of desire to know everything before they engage in conversations, as well as the typical female sort of tendency to underestimate ourselves and our level of knowledge. We did also find that online searches amongst men and women show men searching around investments and women searching around families, budgeting and saving, which indeed we have seen in previous years, but not to the extent we're seeing it this year. And the disparity we see in all age groups, But what is really interesting is it's particularly obvious when we look at the difference between confidence in long-term saving versus short-term finances, where actually the gap is very much smaller. Interestingly, the gender gap in managing long-term finances only closes significantly in the much older age groups. And I'm afraid that's probably because that's the point at which women have to manage their pension, or indeed, sadly, to sort of survive widowhood or divorce when they are effectively on their own. These are the points I referred to earlier, that women will tend to search around savings topics, men around investing topics, and you do see the sort of male bias being strengthened as well in terms of the output that we see in those two spaces, where the investing output has a very, very masculine feel about it. The saving output has a far more feminine, family feel to it. Actually, it's much more inviting, which is something Winnie will come on and talk about later. If we exclude those that are saying they don't have enough money to make investing worthwhile, though I think that's also an important point for the industry, because it's very often a misperception. Women think they need more money before they can invest, before they do. It is, again, this factor of women feeling that they just don't know enough. And it again goes back to this lack of confidence. So you can see a sort of vicious circle operating here. But interestingly, and perhaps most worryingly, it is the fact that both women and men think the investment industry has a better understanding of men, particularly on an individual level. We know from work done by McKinsey that women are very, very influenced by people in this space. And the need for empathy is very, very strong. Indeed, empathy was rated as one of the top 5 qualities among tweeters who seem to be craving at the moment. So we shouldn't forget about the need to be empathetic, particularly towards women, which can be difficult in an industry which is actually heavily dominated by men. I think what is interesting is the further example of differences in the perception between younger women and men. And it has to be a concern that more than half of younger women compared to a third of younger men do feel that the industry doesn't understand them. And this is surely behind a very large number of them saying they are just not considering investing. They just don't feel it's a place for them to go. But I'd like to end with 2 slides, which I think bring home this point, because overall, actually men and women don't see financial services overall as being particularly gender biased. It's pretty gender neutral compared with things like auto at the top being very heavily male biased, baby at the bottom being very heavily female biased. So actually, if you think about financial services overall, you can see the balance is pretty even. But to come back to the investing point, it's when we begin to look at for men, for women in the investment space, and particularly among younger men, the difference between younger men and younger women is actually very stark. And we can see, you might say, well, it's obvious, cryptocurrencies are arguably the closest to gaming, which is seen as, again, very masculine, as being much more for men, whereas ESG investing, impact investing, sustainable investing, and we know from other studies that this is an area which actually women feel passionately about, and it goes back to that reawakening of social consciousness we talked about earlier. That is the place where actually the gap narrows very dramatically between men and women in the investment space. But I hope I've illustrated from our survey how gender differences in relation to saving and investing are in fact quite polarizing, and it's time to hand over to Winnie to show how the 2 worlds can be brought more closely together.
Thank you, Rosie. So there is this stark picture around investment, but not so much in financial services. And actually this perception is a reflection of how the industry is showing up. So when we run our search analysis, the type of content that appears for savings and investment appears really differently. So on the left-hand side, you can see the search outcomes for savings, which tends to be, really brightly colored websites with supportive conversational tone. And it's typically narrated by a woman. And then on the right-hand side, search outcomes for investment tend to be what you associate with, a typical banker. So the appearance of the websites are less colorful. They tend to have very serious tone and very functional and technical jargon. So with what we've seen so far, there is a clear call to action for the industry itself to narrow this kind of gender divide. So what can the industry do to generate broader interest around investment? When we ask this question to our respondents, there are a number of tangible things that the industry can do. The first is that the industry needs to have a better representation from internally. So it's not just reflective of the UK population, but also having a workforce and also wealth management who are less male dominated. The way that investment organizations communicate also needs to be more down to earth. What we've seen coming through our search analytics just now reflects that. And women are still looking for that safety and comfort in cash. So product offerings and positioning needs to have a more balanced view when we're talking about investment. So what we've heard is loud and clear that communication, female representations are two key aspects. And with that in mind, we've taken a look at the number of ads in the market recently. So I'm going to try to play one of them here for you. I haven't tested technology, so we will see if that works or not. If not, then I can describe what the ad does in that particular campaign.
Invest with Hargreaves Lansdown today, and you'll thank yourself later. Thank you. Switch your money on with the UK's #1 platform for private investors.
Right, so technology apparently works, which is amazing. So looking at the video just now, I think you'll agree that the story actually ties very closely with the narrative they're trying to convey, which is invest today and you'll thank yourself later. In fact, it's performed really well in getting the audience to find out more about what Hargreaves Lansdown is trying to offer. And so we've also looked at, a number of things around people's facial expressions. We cover a number of, facial expressions, but we've pulled out two of them specifically here. One is around the smile. So it's usually a reflection of how enjoyable the narrative is, how people are accepting the narrative. And the other is around frowning, which means that, the narrative itself isn't landing particularly well. So what we can see here on the left-hand side is that women, which is the pink line here, is really enjoying the narrative. They're particularly smiling more in, two key points here around, when the first time the little girl says mom, and also when the doorbell rings. So you can see, throughout the whole narrative, you can hear specifically what is going on, that women are enjoying the narrative. But on the flip side is that men are frowning quite a bit as the narrative goes along. And I think this reflects the particular role that the brand is having in the whole ad itself. It's not particularly clear why they are there. So I think there's a good intention in terms of trying to have better female representation, inviting women in terms of investment, but actually there's still a bit more work to be done for the industry. So what should the new world of investing for women look like? Our work itself has looked into two key things that organizations who want to win with women should potentially do. So the first job is to invite women in. At the moment, a lot of these comms in the market about everyday finance sit squarely in this particular space. And you can see that on the left-hand side, these imageries, it's all about mom trying to make it work. Brands need to invite women in to demonstrate that they have that openness and inclusivity to break down the perceived gender barriers around financial products and services. The second job to be done here is inspire women to reach the world of wealth. You can see the comms of investment brands sitting on this particular space. The imagery itself you can see here is very solitary. It's usually portraying an accomplished achiever enjoying their success, which potentially could be unattainable to some people. So the sector needs to think about, how can we demonstrate a very tangible and relevant benefit and also a payoff for women to create that behavior change towards investment. And we further decoded these imageries around what we called the need scope framework that Amy introduced earlier on. This framework looks at emotive needs, and it's in this particular scenario, we look at depictions of financial confidence. Similar to what we've seen previously with the online search content, comms that we've codified for everyday finance and investment is again like polarized on the two ends of the spectrum. So on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side here, where we termed approachability and power. Comms that currently invite women, sitting on the left, and inspiring on the right, which means that there's still a lot of white space in between for brands to tap into when talking to women about investment, and for brands itself to stand for something unique. In order to tap into these white spaces, we need to start thinking about, what the world of finance look like for women. How are they talking about it? So we used our AI tool that's been developed by our specialists and cultural insights experts here at Kantar. We scoped out some of the hashtags relating to women and finances, thinking about the language that they would use on social media. And then we collected thousands of samples from Instagram posts shared by real people under these hashtags. When we start clustering them, we review some big codes and themes around the topic. We discovered that women have a very holistic way of sharing about money and finance online. They share their personal aspects of the journey as a way to inspire themselves and others, and showing the ups and downs. So it could be celebrating success or talking about their struggles. And we've grouped them into kind of 4 predominant themes. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, and we're happy to follow up after today's webinar if you're interested. But for example, for Stronger Together, that's not something we typically see when we're codifying existing comms out there. So if you're working in the financial services category, is that something you could own and invite and inspire women to investing? So we've covered quite a lot of grounds around, what the industry can potentially do, what we've seen. So we've come up with a 5-point plan around investment to make it more inviting and inspiring for women. So the first one is around reducing that separation of saving and investing. We see the financial services sector itself is actually quite neutral. So how can we bring the two worlds together? And so that when we're talking about saving and investing, we're not trying to silo them separately. We should also change the imagery and tone of the communications to represent women of today. So thinking about financial wellness, not just about wealth itself. Position your brand in an emotive territory and consider the most promising themes that is relevant to your organization. The third one is to establish a really clear role for your brand in transforming the lives of women to make sure that they can succeed the financial and life goal together. And represent this consistently and clearly in every encounter you have with them. The fourth one is what Rosi has covered quite a bit earlier on, around placing greater emphasis on impact investing. As we noted, every 3 in 4 women in the UK think that ESG investing will actually make a difference to the society. So it's a really important point to them. So talk about it. And then finally, increase your focus around the younger millennial women. Make sure that these investors of the future feel that they are worthy and valuable to be thinking about investment, and help to increase their confidence and manage their long-term finances and close that self-esteem gap that Rosi has talked about. But it needs to go beyond that, and we've talked a little bit about this earlier on, is about financial institutions need to work from the inside out. Here are some stats from a recent survey from the Diversity Project, which we have done with them. It's an initiative from the industry to examine the representation of the category itself, of the workforce within asset management. And even with the future projection, the gender representation of asset management has still some way to go for gender parity. So think about the composition of gender within your organization. Is it impacting your culture and brand? And is there a cause for greater equity? And then finally, it's not just about financial services organizations trying to invite women. It's also about women to kind of invite themselves in as well. So the first one that we've come up with is actually realize that you may be an investor without knowing it. We've seen that 37% of the women are unconscious investors because they've got some pensions, but they consider themselves not as investors. So pay more attention to how your pension is growing and lobby your employer potentially to offer access to financial advisors. The next one is around having greater confidence in your own ability to manage all types of money. So thinking about, you are currently managing your own or even your family finances. So don't think yourself as unworthy of professional advice. The third one is recognize and invest to help sustainable business thrive. Women have become more socially and locally conscious over the past year. So think about the businesses you want them to grow, and so invest in them so that we are all successful in the future. The fourth one is talk to other women about their experiences. Identify the financial services brands that have treated them well, and potentially think about, is that a brand for you? And the fifth one is around developing a longer term financial plan for your own goals and expectations so that you're more confident and have higher self-esteem. And before I pass on to Amy to talk to our panel discussion, why does it matter at the moment to close this gender investment gap? Because it just makes financial sense, not just for the industry, but also for women. There's a mutual financial benefit in inspiring and inviting women to invest, which in turn create this circular effect that is beneficial to everybody. And finally, why now? Businesses and individuals have the opportunity to build on this kind of savings habit that we have unconsciously been doing in the last year. So the recognition and importance of financial independence and the dominant contribution to overall well-being, all these three factors have increased in the past year. So brands have an opportunity to stand out and demonstrate that they can transform lives of individual women by converting their understanding that there is a gender gap into more positive actions. And importantly, now is the moment to take this opportunity and the current climate to help transform the perception around wealth accumulation to wider wellness. And with that, I'm going to leave you with this quote here from the late Shirley Williams to wrap up around the society's perception around women and what they can do. So I'm going to hand over Amy now in all our panels to talk about this particular topic.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you, Rosi, as well for those findings. Very insightful, if a little concerning. And thanks to those of you who are already commenting in the chat and the Q&A about some of your observations. Please do keep that coming, and we will be able to deal with some of those as we go through this panel discussion. So without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our panel. Let me just say a little bit about each of our panelists before we move to the discussion. Starting with Michelle, who is the head of marketing strategy innovation at the NatWest Group. And at NatWest, she's developed the new visual NatWest identity and brand platform Tomorrow Begins Today, which is really trying to connect to that younger, more digital audience. And prior to that, she was the marketing director at Bo, who were a NatWest banking app, which looked to connect with people who were turned off by banking and advertising. So certainly connecting with some of the points we've made already about inclusivity in this sphere. And the second person to introduce is Jude Kelly CBE, who's the founder and director of the WOW Foundation. The WOW Foundation runs WOW, which stands for Women of the World Festivals. And Jude is also a former artistic director of London's South Bank Centre. Jude's directed over 200 theatre and opera productions and founded a range of companies, arts institutions, and commissioned and supported the work of thousands of artists across all sorts of genres. And in 2019, Jude founded Smart Purse with Olga Miller, which is a new financial educational toolkit for women. And last but no means least, Caroline Bloor, who is the Consumer Affairs Director for Hearst lifestyle brands, which includes Good Housekeeping, Red and Prima, combined circulation of almost 750,000, including myself, for Good Housekeeping, I must say. She has been the editorial lead for the launch of 2 consumer-facing websites. And 3 years ago, she founded Hearst's highly successful cross-brand, cross-platform initiative, Financially Fabulous. And as editor of Financially Fabulous, Caroline's combined more than 25 years of consumer-facing editorial expertise and a deep understanding of Hearst's wide-ranging female audience to create finance content that inspires, educates, and informs. And Financially Fabulous's strong industry partnerships have led to award-winning campaigns, and I imagine we're going to talk about some of those as we go through the panel. So welcome, Michelle, Jude, Caroline. It's wonderful to have you here. I hope that everyone can see you. I'm just seeing a black screen, so I'm going to assume that everyone can see our panelists. I hope so. So I just wanted to start with a question really about some of the things we saw at the very start of the presentation around the actual observation that we've seen the savings increase enormously in this group. I wonder if I could just start with you, perhaps, Michelle, and just ask you what you think it is about the pandemic that has made that penny drop and that need to save happen. And also, is it something just that's happening now, or is it part of a larger overall change?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The work that we did at Bloor was specifically looking at how you could unlock savings behaviour, and some of the data that we'd seen historically was that actually one of the drivers to saving.
Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you, Michelle. Just one moment. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sorry, I can hear you now. Sorry.
Is that okay? Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah. So when we were at Bloor, we did a lot of work looking at how we can actually unlock savings behaviour, especially for people that, you know, sort of basically are budgeting. So sort of either through lifestyle or life stage, they're just trying to make their money go further. And I think one of the things that we learned about that was actually saving behaviour isn't necessarily driven completely by income. It's actually, you know, so often the higher the salary you get, you can just basically budget back down to zero. So one of the things we were trying to do, just get nicer clothes and go out for nicer meals, especially sort of when you're younger. And so what we were trying to look at was how could we basically unlock that savings behaviour? And so some of the insight that we got there was, you know, it's often due to a shock where people will actually sort of start to save. So it might be that you get made redundant, or that, you know, it might be that even you get fraud on your account and you realise that you need that buffer zone. Obviously, a big global pandemic, whilst none of us wanted that, has actually given people that shock, and I think that as a consequence of that, it's made them realize their discretionary spend. So, you know, often the talk is always about coffees and things like that, but if you're commuting on a daily basis and all of a sudden that discretionary spend becomes available to you, you start to realize the incremental value in terms of the things that you spend. So I think that the pandemic has done two things. Is one, it's kind of unlocked the need, which is to provide that buffer zone to protect, but also through sort of incremental savings for those people fortunate enough to keep their jobs. And it's important to bear in mind that some other people haven't been as fortunate. It's also enabled people to realise from a discretionary spend point of view just how much money they have been spending on things, and actually with taking that spending away, the impact that has over time. So I think it is a moment in time for people to realise, and now that they've actually started the savings behaviour, it'll be interesting to see what they do with that income that they're sort of sitting on.
Yeah, so you think from a longer term perspective, this potentially could be something that will persist?
I think it'll be interesting, and if you look at spending behaviour now, it seems like it sort of seems to be going on the up. And I think again, it's a question in terms of the other area that we thought in terms of what you can do to unlock savings behaviour is future anchoring. So, you know, what are you saving for rather than just saving for a generic thing? And I think that's one of the things that really comes through for me, is that actually, you know, Klarna does this brilliantly in the credit space, is they anchor to the need. And I think one of the language around saving is quite passive. So it's often talking about rainy day funds. But when you think about it, you know, what was most striking for me in the research that you showed, this concept of financial independence and actually what that means. And, you know, we talked a lot about the sort of flip the table fund in terms of what a buffer zone can actually give you is that choice, because basically what additional money gives you is optionality. So I think the way that we can frame the reason and the motivation to save will help people look more for long-term savings rather than short-term.
Thank you. And Jude, could I just ask your thoughts on that as well, in terms of the longer term nature of this change we've seen?
Well, I think that first of all, we have to be optimistic about the fact that once we get hold of a conversation that we realize has been stuck for hundreds or thousands of years, and say this is a systemic problem for women, once we understand that, which is happening in all kinds of areas to do with getting the research, getting the data and going, oh my God, this is horrendous. Then we start saying, well, obviously that's unjust, it's not fair, what are the reasons? And we start making changes. And I think this conversation about money is quite recent. You know, obviously there've been women in the financial sector for a long time, but perhaps more than anywhere else except maybe tech, it's been absolutely critical that those women played the rules of the game by almost presenting as men in terms of the attitudes.
Wow.
One of the things that kind of encouraged me, or that compelled me, if you like, to start Smart Perth with Olga, was because although the WOW festivals cover everything from, you know, sexual harassment through to the politics of Afro hair, the question around money produced in women such an emotional reaction of shame, of complexity, insecurity, I'm not valued, I can't value myself, etc. And it was far beyond what I had expected. In other words, I think I'd assumed that we would have a kind of technical relationship to money, but we don't. We have a very emotional relationship to money where we've been excluded and we therefore exclude ourselves. But the reason why I think it's optimistic is that because women are so value driven, that's why we invest in families and communities. And therefore, that's why we're interested in investing in sustainable planets and good supply chains and so on. And I think that instead of money being viewed as something by women which sort of belongs to the land of the technical, we should embrace the idea that it belongs to the land of the emotional and say, we're not going to be scared of it and we're not going to be pushed aside from it. We're going to know that we need our hands on those levers and we're going to use it for the way that we think our families, our communities and our world should be run. So the reason I'm optimistic is because I think it's not up to the financial services to sort of find more gooey language, you know, just more women being pregnant in the pictures. It's actually about the financial services rethinking for themselves the fact that, yes, money makes the world go round, but it's about ethics and values, and that's what women are interested in. So it's a combination of much greater confidence that we need to have, that not just that we should value our place in society and demand it, but that we have values that society needs. So it's a double thing that I'm confident, actually, we're beginning to make changes happen in both sides.
And I really like that point you make about the emotive aspect to it, because it's certainly something that's come through from our work where we see the way that it's impacting self-esteem. We saw that a few years ago, but the way that that's increased, you know, it just goes to demonstrate the way it connects to so many other aspects of women's lives. Caroline, I wonder if I could turn to you on this, you know, thorny topic of the difference we see between millennial men and women. You know, I know when we've done a lot of our work in the past around differences between gender, we've kind of almost hoped that as things have changed, we won't see some of the differences in the younger generations of women that are men that we've seen in older generations. And that hasn't actually proved to be true. I mean, from your experience, why do you see that difference between millennial men and women around these issues of saving and investment?
I think it actually starts at a very early age, and it's not really just when young men and women enter the workplace. I think even though we have compulsory maths up to GCSE level, there's still a pervasive perception that maths is for boys. And I think it's also to do with the way that you're raised and the roles you see your parents taking, who's the main breadwinner, who pays the bills, who makes the big decisions. And even after GCSE, obviously maths then is no longer compulsory. There's this imbalance in the number of girls doing maths and economics at A level and at uni. And young men build on the early confidence that they have, I think, to be more sort of financially fearless and to take more risks. And whereas girls join the workplace and the gender pay gap may already be eroding confidence levels, because we know that already they will not be earning necessarily the same amounts as their colleagues doing the same roles. So I think you're even less likely to take risks with your money if you have less of it, e.g., you know, don't invest what you can't afford to lose. So I think it does go, you know, way back to a very, very early stage of our development, really. And whilst we have economic well-being and financial capability on the curriculum for most schools, I think we need to spend less time teaching children about the pure maths and trigonometry, you know, the sort of angles within angles, parallelograms, and make much more room for teaching them about compound interest and taxes. You know, this is the stuff they're really going to need. I also think that investing is just not on the radar for many young women. There's plenty of encouragement about spending. You know, we're encouraging them, we encourage everyone to buy now, even if you can't afford it. You know, there are ways around, aren't there? Whether it's a payment plan or installation or credit cards. But there's less education and advice on how to achieve the things that you want through saving and financial planning. So we really need to shift that dial so that long-term saving is in the national psyche for both young women and men in a way that spending is. Yeah. One of the things that really annoys me is when on TV you've got people earning big cash prizes on game shows and things, and then it's all about, oh, how, you know, what are you going to buy? You know, car, you know, bigger house, big holiday. I would just love it if somebody turned around and said, well, actually, I'm going to invest the money and make more money from it in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a question of the way that women get valued externally. So, you know, we are valued by, you know, our clothes, our makeup, our handbags, our shoes, you know, our trinkets, if you like. And then subsequently, you know, the quality of the buggy and the quality of the children's clothes. And all of this means that we, you know, we're heavy consumers, but we're not heavy investors, because if you like, our value is being judged by something decorative and external. You know, a man can go around in one suit or a tracksuit for ages and ages, never needing to change it, except for hygiene reasons, obviously. And people aren't going to say, oh dear, you know, that's so dowdy. Whereas actually, we are really forced to spend tons of money on unnecessary things. And that's up to us to change that mindset too.
And Michelle, I was wondering if I could bring you here on the point about the millennial differences, because I know that you guys have done quite a lot of work in this area, not actually with Hearst, I know on a couple of occasions as well. Could you just talk to us a bit about that and how you felt that helped in this area?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, it was off a real strategic partnership, and, you know, both Hearst and NatWest Group are really focused on financial capability and unlocking women. And I think the real insight around that was that one of the barriers to career is actually that first move into the city, and actually the deposit that's needed and things like that. And actually the social gaps got broader. So really sort of founded on a real goal to basically enable that first step into career freedom. Because again, as we're talking about the gender pay gap, you know, there's also an opportunity in terms of, you know, actually landing that first job, which often tends to be in a city. So we brought 5 women together and basically sat them in a house together, funded their rent, because again, things like getting a deposit for a house, you know, all these barriers that are big chunks of money that aren't potentially accessible to women. But then from there, I think that the big thing for us is rather than expect women to come to us, so to come to the NatWest domain to find out about money, is actually we went where the eyeballs are. And obviously that's what Cosmo is brilliant at, and really understands millennial women, and sort of talked about that diversity of choice. So there's lots of different women with different career aspirations, different situations, and different money goals. So I think that, you know, it's, for me, it's really important that we don't put a value judgment in terms of what women want, because some women will want shiny shoes or a nice holiday, and other women will want to invest there. And I think it came through in some of the comments, you know, women are not a single thing, and, you know, sort of and I think that diversity of choice and diversity of ambition is really important, and that we don't make a value judgment between good money and bad money. It's basically to enable and empower people to that financial independence so that they have their own autonomy. And I think that what we learned from the content that we created is by talking about what their goals were, by talking about what they wanted, and helping sort of frame some of the conversation around financial capability and money management towards those goals and towards those needs, and also towards some of those blockers. As we've all talked, money is hugely emotional to a lot of women. Less so if you work in banking, but more so sort of general public. And I think that, you know, understanding some of those emotional barriers, and, you know, women have, one of the things that we noticed is people talk generically about their own behavior. So I'm awful at money, as if it's something inherently and as a personality, and actually sort of trying to unlock that and explain, but also show progress. So, you know, you start in debt, and actually over time showing the journey, showing the ease, talking about the emotional barriers and creating that content and narrative. And, you know, it's been one of the most successful brand partnerships that Cosmo has run, which is, you know, up against some of the other things such as travel and entertainment. And it shows that conversations around money can be appealing to millennial women if it's framed in a way that's appropriate and contextual.
Absolutely. I mean, that campaign was enormously successful, you know, reaching 1 in 3 women aged 18 to 34 in the UK.
Wow.
Which is huge. And I think, as Michelle says, you know, one of the reasons that the campaign was so successful is because it took the finance in to where the Gen Y and Gen Z readers are, into their world, you know, the shared house, the lifestyle website, IGTV, TikTok, the places that they know and feel comfortable, rather than NatWest expecting the young women to come and walk through their door. And I think one of the stats that always blows my mind is that more than 80% of internet traffic is video content.
Yeah.
So much time is spent online by especially this generation. And I think the financial services industry really needs to get into this space to get their messaging across, you know, YouTube, TikTok, IGTV. It's about communication, but communication in the right place.
Yeah, and if you look at the TikTok influencers on money influencers on TikTok, they're having different conversations. And it's one of the things that we were aware of when we did a lot of social media listening. The words that we use as a financial institution, they don't come up in terms of any social listening, but when you use the natural language that you use, such as payday, skins, you know, sort of all that, actually the conversations are equivalent to the conversations around relationships. So I think that the other thing is that we have to really understand how people talk about money and the role that money plays in people's lives, because it's not often not in isolation. It's often in a means to, you know, whatever your goals or ambitions are. And I think that's the goal that we need to do, is understand how we talk about money in a way that's relevant and compelling to people.
And I think that's what really earlier when I said that, you know, a lot of women work in the financial sector, if you like, get their stripes by demonstrating they know how to do the jargon and the walk and the thing. Whereas actually, I think women in any walk of, for any profession, we have to be braver about saying, actually, we're charting a different path, we're telling a different story with different language, because actually the language that you're proposing isn't relevant to 50% of the world. So I think, you know, it's to do that, you have to have a lot more solidarity between women at work as well. Because I think women in the financial sector still struggle with an idea of legitimacy, and you know, it isn't just up to women to change the imagery inside the financial sector and the language, but a lot rests on us, doesn't it?
Well, and actually the industry was something, you know, we were interested to talk about, because you know, our recent work with the diversity project, which Winnie alluded to in one of her charts, has sort of shown the discrepancy around diversity that exists in the industry. I mean, do you think that that is fundamental to some of the challenges here, or do you think that that's still something that could be overcome by that industry if they were to just talk about things in a different way? I mean, do you have a point of view on that?
Well, I personally think you can't overcome representation, intelligent representation, theoretically. I think you have got to have diversity. I mean, you know, we're an all-white women panel, and you know, that's not the best. I just say that. I think we would all feel that that's not where we need to be at all. And you can't speak on behalf of other people's lives, you know, as if you are the center and the knowledge maker. And I think men have been told that they are like the universal figure that can speak on behalf of humanity, and that women only speak about women. And this is another problem. It's like, well, if we need to understand women, let's get some women in. But we don't ask them to speak about the whole ecosystem. So I think it's critical that the financial sector changes who works within it, and not just who works within it, but who leads it. And when you have people like Alison Rose and you have people like Inga Beale who are prepared to say, yes, not only am I a leader, but I'm also going to speak specifically about feminism, you know, i.e. the idea of equity and equality for girls and women, then you are changing the story.
And just to build on that, I think the other thing that we did is we did a lot of archetypal work when we were looking at Bow. And one of the things is that whilst we built the proposition around some of the insight that we were seeing in terms of what, you know, how to talk about money, how the role of money in people's lives, is actually when you tested that with men, actually men really responded well to it as well. So I think it's the differentiation between the female archetype and just some of the humanity, relational element, emotional elements, all the good stuff about sort of, you know, sort of being more balanced in terms of how we talk, rather than the sort of so-called masculine traits of just being analytical, spending wheels, you know, sort of things like that. And it's the balance of that that also appeals to men as well. So I think there's a broader opportunity in terms of bringing the humanity to money. And I think there's a win far broader than just appealing solely to women and painting everything pink.
I totally agree with that, and the findings we had from the report we did a couple of years ago were very clear that no one feels very confident about money. It's certainly true that women feel less confident than men, but when you look at the overall percentages, it's still very low levels for men. And our feeling then was absolutely, if you could do things to make the industry more confidence giving, more engaging, using different language, as you say, more human language, that there would be a knock-on effect that would benefit everybody. Just around that point, and we looked a lot at the language and the communications in the research we did. I don't know, Caroline, have you got views on how organisations can talk about the concept of financial wellness and thinking about investing for the future and things in a way that really does inspire women to get engaged?
Yes, it was interesting because we know that from our readers that there is this real lack of confidence even in talking about money issues and investing in particular. You know, our readers tell us a lot that investing is too risky, it's sort of impenetrable jargon, you know, I don't have enough to start investing, and that it's more of a men thing. And when we surveyed women for Good Housekeeping, we found that what they found most difficult to talk about generally, 30% said it was money. And I think until we're talking much more openly about money and, you know, pay packets and debt, etc., it's, you know, that is a crucial thing that we need to get over. We found that 32% of readers, only 32% of readers would confide in a close friend about their money worries. So there's still a real barrier. Because talking about money creates the empathy that we've been talking about that really needs to happen. I think that there are a lot of hurdles in the way of sort of getting the message over. But I think one of the things that comes to mind is just, as I say, taking it into the spaces where people already are. And we found that by covering off issues through, you know, we have Financially Fabulous, which is a brand that works across all the different brands at Hearst, whether it's Women's Health and Cosmo and Good Housekeeping and Prima and Red. And we've taken money content into those brands, into the lifestyle environments that people are used to reading, they trust, they love those magazines, they love the websites. And it means that we can talk about everything from budgeting through to making a will, you know, the importance of having insurance, the importance of long-term planning. The reason why we got started with Financially Fabulous in the first place was because we do a feature every year, a really big feature on pensions for Good Housekeeping. And we had such a huge postbag one year. And we asked people what questions they wanted to put to the pensions minister then, which was Ros Ormond at the time. And we were absolutely flooded with questions. And this happened to be around the changes to state pension and, you know, women being very angry because of the moving of the goalposts.
Yeah.
And, you know, the 6 years that they're going to miss out. And that is what got us started to realize that, you know, where you really get it, where the what ifs are becoming a reality, which is what they've done during the pandemic, then people, you know, they feel the sharp end and they focus. And that was our launch point for Financially Fabulous. And we've been incredibly successful in getting our messaging across, as I say, a huge range of women because of this and because of the way we interact within the brands, you know, both websites and in print and in social media, in the places that people are already inhabiting. And it's not just right, you've got to have an article on investing now. It will be about money and relationships, about not mistaking, you know, financial independence it means you don't love someone if you want to be financially independent. You know, you can have your separate savings and your own long-term goals, and this is all good. So yeah, I think this is very, very important, and media have a huge role to play in this communication message.
Yeah, absolutely. at Smart Purse, we have lots of different communities of women, both live and online. We do the money rallies, which look at everything, as you've just said, Caroline, that are from how do you deal with your partner when he says to you, well, why do you need to look at the bank balance? Are you thinking of leaving me? Which is a common thing that we heard, through to, how do we want to invest what little we've got in a sustainable planet? And that breadth of information, I think that women need to feel they can come in at any point, rather than that they have to start at the beginning and then kind of work up to something. I think they should just start from whatever excites them and interests them. And that's the way that you learn about stuff. Some people learn about how to manage their budgets because they have to pay for their kids to go into rehab. Some people learn how to manage their budgets because they're looking at care homes. There's loads and loads of ways that family politics, if you like, drives women to look at money. But I think there are two extremes that I want to point out, which is, on the one hand, we have been encouraged not to have value to our lives. We do tons of work for nothing, as you can see from the statistics about domestic labor, for nothing. And that then translates into 97% of nurses are women, 98% of care workers are women, 92% of primary school workers are women, all low paid. So the idea that women's work isn't valued is something that we are still carrying around with us. And on the other hand, we're also taught that money is sort of dirty. It's like not nice. So apart from the shame of being poor, if you are in the wine bar with women and they start saying, "Oh, I really want like a load of cash," you tend to think that's vulgar, because we've been groomed to think that this is like a nasty ingredient. And we've got to stop that. Money is as good as the use you put to it. And we, at Smart Purse, we're constantly trying to say, get our hands on as much money as possible to give women more value, and then put value back into the society for the things that we care about.
I think that's a brilliant insight, and it was one thing that I noticed looking at the imagery, sort of how we define aspiration. All the women on their own, sort of looking into the middle distance, and actually what we need to do is we need to own success. We need to show and success in it. It doesn't have to be family. I know people push back on some of the video that we see. It's like, but we need that aspiration, and we need to show a picture of success, because there is an issue in terms of this perception that you get more and more successful, and then it has issues for your partner, it has issues for your friends. One of the things that we found at Bow is that people were happy to talk about money when everyone was on the same salary, so around students. But as there started to be a change, that was when money got sticky. And then there's the issue around relationships in terms of earning more money than your partner and all those kind of challenges. And we need to be able to unlock that, so that actually aspiration is something that we want to get to, and it's not just about being the caretaker or whatever it is it's actually it's the ability to own that power. And I'm very lucky to have a female CEO that sort of can personify that. But we need to show those different flavors of success, so that it's not just the lonely old woman sitting in a tower, sort of in the nice power suit. We need to have different flavors of it.
Yeah, and I'm slightly conscious of time because we're getting a lot of questions through. So I want to make sure we've got a little bit of time for that. So I'm going to move to a question. Could I just ask anyone who's watching, if you would like to ask a question, could you just pop it in the Q&A box? Because the chat is very busy, which is lovely, and we love to see that. But it is very difficult to find the questions in there. So if you'd like to pop your question in the Q&A, I will try and make sure that we see it. Thank you. Okay, so here's a question for the panel. There's a lot of data around women being more inclined to ESG investing, charitable investing, but is this a product of the women who are able to invest? And could we be reinforcing stereotypes with that sort of data? Would any of the three of you like to take that question?
Well, I'd like to bring in a point to that, which is that, it's fantastic that there is this greater interest in the environment and sustainability. And I know from your survey, 72% of women think impact investing will make a difference to society, which is a fantastic figure. But when in January we asked the Hearst audience, how easy do you find it to understand if a bank or investment company is investing funds and behaving ethically, 88% said that either it wasn't very easy to understand or it was impossible. And there was generally very low confidence in terms of making ethical or eco-friendly investments. So I think whilst there is this appetite, especially now, this sort of post-pandemic appetite for investing for good, companies actually need to work a lot harder to communicate what it is they're doing in this space and how it's of benefit. You know, they need to be far more transparent, because otherwise there will be a complete disconnect and a lost opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing, just to build on that, is that one of the things about ESG funds is that they're you understand what they are. You know, you understand what you're buying, and you understand what, you know, there's a story behind them, and there's something that you can actually invest in. And I think whilst we're seeing data that, yes, there's definitely a gender correlation, the question in my mind is that also other investment funds are quite opaque. And so the other thing for it is how do we demystify it, again, to enable choice, knowing that, again, to Jude's point, is we do tend to be more value-based in terms of what we're drawn to. And I think that definitely should be an option. But I also think, just more broadly, one of the things is that how do we make it clearer about all the investment portfolio so that people can feel more confident in terms of what they're buying, and make that choice based on that.
I also think that women are going to start inventing new products to just bypass all of this, you know, language and obscuring of clarity. You know, we've been brilliant at book clubs. So, you know, the majority of clubs around the world are women, and therefore the spend on women's literature, obviously they don't only read women's books, but, you know, the relationship between book clubs and publishing sales are huge. So I'd like to do the same with investment clubs. So certainly Smart Purse is looking at how do we form investment clubs. You know, it's easy. And after all, you know, things like Weight Watchers, Fitbit, you know, the whole kind of journey of health. I mean, it took a long time before people started taking the mickey, you know, out of yoga, but people don't do that any longer. And so I think it's a question of owning the need for us to talk about money, and then changing the way that we do it and making it as personal as we've all suggested it ought to be. You know, build it around communities, smaller groups, and have our own investment clubs. I mean, that's what I think we're going to do. And that will change the nature of the business inevitably.
I think that's interesting. A couple of people have asked the question around, you know, how do you ask for more money when you get a job? How do you raise that conversation? I mean, I always quite enjoy Cindy Gallup's quote that you should just ask for the highest number you can without bursting out laughing, which just seems like quite one way to tackle the problem. But I mean, in terms of, you know, we've talked about this point about vulgarity. I think you mentioned it, Michelle, as well. You know, what are the strategies that people can use to overcome that feeling of being uncomfortable around talking about it, do you think? Or do you think it is literally something we have to wait for it to become more comfortable generally in society before that happens? Though obviously they are circular.
I think there's a really good book by Michelle Walker saying which you are what you risk. And I think one of the things that we have to do is talk about risk. And it's really hard, obviously, in financial services because there's a regulatory need to talk about risk, but there's loss aversion, but there's loss of opportunity as well. You know, women are under you know, often for life insurance, they're underinsured. You know, we talk about the pension gap, but I think one of the things that we need to do is start to have bigger conversations. I mean, I think one of the things that Michelle Walker talks about is how influenced we are by, you know, societal and peer. And I think until those conversations have mass resonance and also colour and variety, so the community element that Jude was talking about, then I think that it's very, you know, it's very hard to do it on your own. And I think we need to normalise and have those conversations about not just about budget management, but also about risk, and, you know, the risk that you don't take as much as the risk that you do take.
Yeah, I think, you know, the risks have got to be put into context. I think, you know, this idea of investing and risk, it's just like a big red light that goes on when you talk to a lot of women. And I think it's a bit like when you open a packet of, you know, antibiotics and you read all the side effects that might happen to you. You know, it has that same sort of feeling about it. So yeah, I think people need to be educated in the different levels of risk, you know, getting people started on the fact that not everything is going to sort of blow up in a puff of smoke. And need to look at the, you know, I think the aversion to risk, You know, it's not just an aversion per se, but it's underlying causes that need to be understood. Like, what would make women more able to take financial risks? You know, is it more equality of pay, more equality of child or elder care responsibilities? You know, and also, will there be more gender inequality with the switch to more home working? That's got to be too, hasn't it?
I think there's also an idea, there's something in the chat about regional, you know, there's an idea of like women who do and women who don't around, you know, it usually is assuming that you will have like higher education and that you will be rich, not just solvent at a basic level. If you think about like the way that we used to think about restaurants, so once upon a time, certainly in, you know, my mum and dad, like going to a restaurant was a really big deal. You know, it was something that was done on special occasions and birthdays, etc. Everybody goes to restaurants. Once upon a time, like paying, I don't know, £36 for Deliveroo to bring round a takeaway for two, that just must have sounded so impossible like 20 years ago, because, you know, aren't you supposed to be cooking your own food? But no, now we do. So I really want women to start realizing that a lot of this is just a cultural attitude. You know, if you're going to spend, you're risking 60 quid on a restaurant that you haven't been to before, you could put that 60 quid in a risk on an investment. So it's small amounts of money. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your educational background is. Actually, you know, you just need to get a grip on the idea that you're entitled to use your money for whatever you want to, but don't be advertised into using it for your makeup, your handbags, and your takeaways. So, you know, that's, you know, I think you said, Caroline or Michelle, I can't remember, but, you know, at school, we're not given the idea that, isn't it exciting? Here's some money, here's your pocket money, here's your paper round money, here's your money from your tips as a waitress. Now let's get going with how you can further the use of that money. And I think it is exciting. I mean, I'm a typical, I didn't think about it at all woman, you know, in the arts. Typically in the arts, you're told, well, money's not very nice really. And as long as you sort of doing what you love, then that's enough. But I now think that's actual bollocks, excuse my language. You know, that's not right. It is not right to encourage women to think that they should be grateful to have a life they love, and that actually money is just sort of additional, surprising extra. That's just ridiculous. But I think it's a product of cultural grooming, and we've got to break it.
Yeah, and I've noticed another question, which was actually, do we think that the underlying investments are a bit of a secondary issue? First and foremost, we have to help women identify their long-term financial goals and objectives and help them understand what they need to do to fund those gaps. I don't know if you guys have any views on that.
Yeah, I think that you know, in behavioral psychology, we talk about future anchoring, and, you know, sort of, I think that one of the things that we don't have time to do often is ask, what do we want in the future, because we're just too busy in the present focus, just because everyone's so busy. And I think that for me, one of the things that we talk all the time in work is, how do we articulate compound interest? Because it's the, you know, if there was one thing that I wish someone would have told my 20-year-old self, it was to understand and unlock the benefit of compound interest. So I think that, you know, sort of, you know, it's inherent, regardless of gender, for us to be present focused rather than future focused. But I think that, especially, you know, if you take time out because of work, because of child rearing or something like that, I think educating people about the investment for the future, the earlier you can, the more that we have the ability to really impact change sort of later in life. So I think that thing about how we can have that conversation around the future and the choices that are available to you, so that the decisions that you make now can really start to build, you know, sort of passively as you grow older.
I'm conscious of time. Unfortunately, we've only got a couple of minutes left, which is a shame, because there's a lot more questions coming through, and we will try and get back to people who've put those questions. I just wanted to finish really with, obviously the pandemic's changed so many things, and we've seen the impact it's had. I just wonder, you know, in terms of the opportunity that it gives us moving forward, I mean, what's the one thing you think we should take away and do differently?
Well, I think it's got to be, I think a good starting point would be getting the message over about stocks and shares ISAs, because so many women think that ISAs are cash ISAs. And, you know, I think as part of that, you've got to talk about the levels of risks. You've got to say, you know, you could supercharge your savings if you put them in a stocks and shares ISA, leave it alone for 5 years. But equally crucially, that you can get your hands on your money in a matter of days if you need to, because that is one of the big blockers to actually investing, you know, and the fact you don't need to put a lot of money away. So, you know, people understand about cash ISAs. Let's get an understanding about stocks and shares ISAs. That's an easy way in to the investing space. That's what I would do.
Okay.
I think that, you know, the question of what does the pandemic teach us? Well, it's taught me that the schisms in society in terms of inequality are huge. And that, so I still think that we as people, it's not just women on this call, I know there are men too, have got to come out and be much louder and less well behaved about saying we're going to close the gender pay gap. We're going to look at the intersectionality problem. You know, if you're a black woman, if you're a woman of color, if you're a disabled woman, you are still going to be paid less proportionally. All of these things have to still count for us because our communities have been exposed really as too unequal. So on the one hand, I want women, as Caroline says and as Michelle says, to kind of grab their own financial security and possibilities. And at the same time, I don't want us to feel that we are not going to go shoulder to shoulder with care workers and nurses and primary school teachers and go, we're going to get better pay. Because why should women carry on having this idea that we are the underclass financially? It's unjust.
And I think that the biggest takeout for me from the research is that financial independence is rating as a bigger need over and above body autonomy. You know, I mean, I think for me that still blows my mind, but also it shows that, you know, for me, it is about that choice and optionality. It doesn't necessarily mean becoming a millionaire. It means being able to leave a partner. It means being able to have the freedom to actually be safe and also to take care. And I think that we need to articulate that. It's, you know, it's not about stilettos and you know, skyscrapers. It's actually about choice and autonomy. And we need to make sure that we can articulate that, to say that people, you know, that actually we can give people that choice. And I think if the one thing that it looks like the pandemic has done is made people realize how fragile they potentially are economically, and actually realize the importance of that. And I think that that's a really important message.
Yeah, at the end of the day, there's nothing more powerful than choice, is there? Having the ability to have choice. Well, we are at time, unfortunately. I just want to say enormous thank you to our panel. I can see from the chat that we've definitely provoked lots of thoughts and questions, so thank you very much. If people are interested in knowing more about the research we've done, obviously there is more to say. We just condensed our main findings down for today. Please do get in touch with us. We'd be happy to share more information. And all that's left for me to do is just say enormous thank you again to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Enjoyed it. Everybody was great. Thanks. Lovely panel to be on.
Thank you.